What if there were secrets out there? Secrets that could completely change how we see God, history, or even ourselves. Do you think those secrets would be shared openly? Or would they be hidden forever? What if there were ancient texts filled with knowledge about the universe, the soul, energy, even the origins of humanity? But they told a story completely different from what we've been taught. Who gets to decide whether or not you're allowed to read them? And if those books really exist, maybe the real question isn't what they say, but who doesn't want you to know? From libraries that burned in the dead of night, to manuscripts sealed away in the vaults of the Vatican, human history isn't just a tale of wars and inventions, it's also a silent war for control over knowledge. And the most powerful weapon in that war isn't the sword, it's censorship. We're often taught that history is the record of truth, passed down through time. But no one really asks, who's holding the pen? And if that pen is in the hands of people afraid of the truth, then how much of what we call official history is actually true? For over 2,000 years, humanity has witnessed countless attempts to censor knowledge, disguised as morality, religion, or politics. From the Vatican's infamous Index Librorum Prohibitorum, its official list of banned books, to China's massive book burnings under Emperor Qin Shi Huang, or the destruction of the Mayan codices by Spanish priests. Across every era, every civilization, there were always things considered too dangerous to share. But dangerous for who? That's the question most people never dare to ask. A book only becomes dangerous when it threatens a system, a power structure, a worldview, or a way of controlling people. These books might reveal that what we believe to be eternal is just repetition. That what we call divine was redefined by human hands, and that truth doesn't always survive. Many ancient texts weren't banned because they were false or superstitious, but because they refused to obey. They spoke of humanity's ability to connect directly with cosmic consciousness. No priest, no temple needed. They hinted at ancient civilizations with advanced knowledge of astronomy, energy, and universal cycles long before the pyramids were even built. They questioned origins, destiny, and faith, and more than anything, they suggested that maybe we're freer than we've been told. Some of these texts say the universe wasn't created by one single God, but by layers of higher beings, each reflecting a deeper level of consciousness. Others suggest that we humans aren't lowly creatures judged by divine forces, but fragments of a greater intelligence, like mirrors of the cosmos. And some of them say plainly knowledge should never be monopolized, and that is exactly why they were destroyed. From the Gospel of Mary Magdalene to the Codex Gigas, from the Nag Hammadi Library to the Corpus Hermeticum, hundreds of texts once existed, written with heart and soul, only to be sealed away, branded as heresy, burned, or simply vanished. But that disappearance wasn't random, it was strategy. Because if you control what people know, you control what they believe. And if you control belief, you control actions, fears, and even the future. So the real question isn't, how many books were banned? It's, are we living in a world where knowledge has already been filtered for us? And if these books are still out there, hidden in vaults, locked in archives, why haven't they been brought into the light? For academic reasons? Because they're unverified? Or because they might shake the very foundations of what keeps people obedient? As we begin to turn the pages of these forbidden books, as we read the words that were once set on fire, we're not just recovering lost history, we're reclaiming the right to understand the world for ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, that is what every system of control has always feared most. This journey won't be easy. It's not some fantasy treasure hunt. It's about confronting what was buried beneath layers of belief. Every book we're about to uncover isn't just a piece of culture. It's a piece of memory that humanity was forced to forget. And sometimes a single sentence is enough to bring down an empire built on lies. So, are you ready to read what they never wanted you to see? Because once you start, you may never look at the world the same way again. When it comes to forbidden texts, few names carry the same weight or mystery as the Book of Enoch. It's an ancient manuscript left out of the official Bible, yet once revered by early Jewish communities and the first followers of Christianity. And then it vanished, not because it was lost, but because it was intentionally removed. The question is why? And even now, long after it was rediscovered, why has it never been brought fully back into the light? This isn't some short pamphlet. The Book of Enoch is long and complex, but the part that made people nervous is the tale of angelic rebellion. According to Enoch, there was once a group of divine beings called the Watchers, angels assigned to watch over humanity. But instead of simply observing, they fell to earth. They took human partners, and they passed down advanced knowledge, astronomy, metallurgy, herbal medicine, lunar cycles, timekeeping, even the secrets of weapons and death. The result of these forbidden unions was the birth of a giant race, the Nephilim, beings considered a threat to the balance of the universe. And that's when the punishment came. The Watchers were imprisoned in the depths. The Nephilim were destroyed, and the knowledge was sealed away. Now, if we stop there, it would just be another myth. But what really matters is how the Church reacted to it. When the Roman Catholic Church was forming the official Bible, it held councils to decide which texts were allowed to be called the Word of God. And even though the Book of Enoch had been quoted by early church fathers like Tertullian, and even referenced in the New Testament's Book of Jude, it didn't make the final cut, not because it was wrong, but because it was too dangerous. The danger wasn't in the wild story, it was in what the story implied, because it challenged the entire theological framework the Church had spent centuries building. If angels had once sinned, rebelled, and handed down knowledge that humans weren't supposed to have, then the idea of one all-controlling God became less stable. And if wisdom about the stars, matter, and the soul had once been given directly to humanity by divine beings, then the Church, as the sole gatekeeper of truth, became unnecessary. This wasn't just a theological issue, it was a direct threat to spiritual authority, because what could be more dangerous than a book that says you don't need a church to reach the divine, that you don't need a pope to understand the universe? That sacred knowledge once belonged to all of us before it was buried. And so Enoch was cut from the Bible, labeled as heresy, buried for nearly 2,000 years. It wasn't until the 18th century that a surviving copy was rediscovered in Ethiopia, where the Ethiopian Orthodox Church had preserved it all along as part of their official canon. When modern scholars began to study Enoch, they didn't just find mythology, they found advanced knowledge. Much of what's written about astronomy, time cycles, and the structure of the heavens strangely aligns with models from ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, even the Maya. The descriptions of solar and lunar movement, of multiple layers of heaven, they suggest ancient people had a far deeper understanding than we ever imagined. And it hints at connections between these civilizations we've never fully explained. If Enoch were accepted as truth, it would destroy the old framework, that God is above, man is below. There would be no hard line between divine and human, no monopoly of authority. And that is exactly what any power system fears. Truth doesn't sit in a prison cell. It hides in the hands of those who get to say, you're allowed to read this, is shit or not. And Enoch is one of the oldest victims of that system. So now we're left asking, if Enoch was hidden because it shone too much light, How many other texts are still buried in dust and darkness? How many truths are still locked behind closed doors, not because they're false, but because they're too true for comfort? We like to believe that time is objective, that a day always has 24 hours, that a year always has 365 days, and that history moves forward along a straight, unchanging path. But what if even time, the very concept of it, was rewritten, redefined, to serve a system of control? This isn't some science fiction theory, it's exactly what the Book of Jubilees hints at, and it's also why it was quietly left out of the official Bible. No dramatic heresies, no wild rebellion, just something more quietly dangerous. It threatened the structure of sacred time. Jubilees is an ancient Hebrew text believed to have been written around the 2nd century BCE. On the surface, it looks like a retelling of Genesis and Exodus, but everything in it is reorganized based on time cycles called Jubilees, each lasting 49 years, or 7 sets of 7. Unlike the vague, loosely dated timeline found in the traditional Bible, Jubilees breaks everything down with astonishing precision, from the creation of the world to key historical events. And more importantly, it uses a 364-day calendar, a fixed system, clean, balanced, completely independent of leap years. And that struck a nerve, because in religion, he who controls the calendar controls everything: the harvests, the festivals, the rituals, the fasts, the holy days, even the moments when people are allowed to connect with God. In other words, control the calendar, and you control spiritual life itself. And for the church, that kind of control was non-negotiable. Back when the Bible was being compiled, there were fierce debates about which calendar was correct: the solar calendar, the lunar calendar, or some hybrid version. The church ultimately adopted the 365-day model with leap years, not because it was more accurate, but because it gave them flexibility to set religious holidays in ways that served authority. But Jubilees didn't allow for that. It was rigid, logical, non-negotiable, and impossible to manipulate. That's what made it dangerous, not because it challenged God, but because it didn't let God be shaped to fit the church's needs. And what made it even more frustrating for religious leaders, Jubilees directly says that corrupting the calendar is one of the reasons humanity fell out of sync with the divine, that when time is twisted, spiritual connection gets distorted too. In one passage, it says, "You will follow the months of the moon and forsake the real year, causing the holy days to fall at the wrong times." That's not just a comment, it's a direct accusation. It implies that religious institutions had traded sacred precision for political convenience. And if that idea ever went mainstream, people would start asking hard questions. Believers might wonder, are the holidays I'm observing even truly sacred? Priests might be forced to explain who decided this calendar was right. And worst of all, the church could lose its greatest weapon, the ability to shape entire societies by syncing them to its own clock. Jubilees isn't the only ancient text with a different view of time, but it's one of the few that lays out its system in crystal clear detail, not just as a religious calendar, but as a full-blown cosmology. Interestingly, the book was preserved by the Essenes, a reclusive, disciplined community living in Qumran, near the Dead Sea. They're the same group believed to have authored many of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And for them, Jubilees wasn't just scripture, it was foundational. That's not a coincidence. To the Essenes, living in alignment with cosmic time meant living closer to God. No churches, no popes, just precision. And that couldn't be allowed to spread. Just like Enoch, Jubilees was excluded from the canon, not because it was heretical, but because it challenged the order, an order that took centuries to construct, from Lent to Easter, from Advent to Christmas. all of it depended on a calendar flexible enough to serve power. Jubilees didn't offer that flexibility, and so it had to go. Today, few people even mention Jubilees. It survives mostly in a few traditions, like the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. In the West, it's been almost completely erased from public consciousness. But its disappearance was no accident. It was a choice to protect the monopoly on time. And once you realize even time can be rewritten, you have to ask, what else can be bent? There was a moment in history, brief but profound, when humanity stood at a crossroads, a moment when people could have been taught that the soul is a sacred spark, independent, eternal, and capable of returning to the light without any gatekeeper. But that moment was buried, and the pieces of it now lie in a tiny Egyptian village, once considered too ordinary to matter, called Nag Hammadi. In 1945, a local farmer stumbled upon a clay jar buried beneath the dry cliffs of Upper Egypt. Inside wasn't just one manuscript, but an entire hidden library written in Coptic. What shocked the world wasn't their age, but what they said. These were Gnostic texts, writings from an ancient spiritual tradition that existed alongside early Christianity. For centuries, Gnosticism had been erased, labeled heresy, and nearly wiped out. But originally it wasn't a cult or a fringe movement. Gnosticism was a philosophy rooted in the belief that human beings could access divine knowledge, gnosis, through inner experience, direct intuition, and spiritual awakening. No priests, no temples, no hierarchical power structure. And that made it a threat, because if every individual can access spiritual truth from within, what is the church's role? If the light is already inside you, then who needs a cathedral to shine it down? Among the texts found in Nag Hammadi were staggering documents, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Wisdom of Jesus, and others that completely reimagined the soul's journey, not as a story of judgment, but as a path back to original light. One line from the Gospel of Thomas reads, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." No external authority, no voice from the heavens commanding obedience, just you, with the divine seed already inside, buried under a false world of illusions. That's the core of Gnosticism, and that's exactly why it had to be erased from official history. The suppression wasn't just in sermons, it was in blood. Those who followed Gnostic teachings were branded heretics, hunted, burned, silenced in the name of defending the faith. Their writings were destroyed or hidden, or, as in the case of Nag Hammadi, buried in the earth to survive. But why was this worldview so deeply feared? The answer lies in how Gnostics saw the world. They believed this material realm was a deception, not created by a supreme god, but by a lesser being called the demiurge, a force of control, structure, and spiritual confinement. And in their eyes, the church was part of that control system. If Gnostic ideas had spread, the entire concept of God ruling from the outside would have been replaced by light awakening from within. And the entire church hierarchy, built on dependence, fear, and spiritual intermediaries, would collapse like a house of cards. But let's be clear, Gnostics weren't anti-God. They were asking a different question. Who is God, really? And more importantly, is God outside us or already within? That question, not the answers, is what truly terrified power structures, because knowledge can be censored, belief can be regulated. But once people learn to ask for themselves, fear loses its grip. The Nag Hammadi library wasn't just a cultural event, it was a fault line, a crack in the foundation of Western theology. a reminder that there once existed people who believed in the absolute freedom of the soul, and that there were others who tried to bury that belief beneath silence. It wasn't until 1945 that the key was accidentally unearthed, but ever since then the question has remained: have we had the courage to truly face the light they once carried? Or are we still walking a path someone else laid for us, where every question comes with a pre-approved answer? If Enoch made us question ancient cosmic knowledge, if Jubilees made us rethink sacred time, then Nag Hammadi forces us to rethink our place in the universe, a soul that never needed permission to be free. Across the thousands of years that history has been told and retold, there's one detail that was quietly pushed aside, not by open denial, but by intentional silence. Mary Magdalene, in the traditional version of the story, is portrayed as a repentant woman, once possessed by demons, later redeemed by Jesus, and eventually remembered as a loyal follower. It's a powerful image, but also a limiting one, a fragile woman in the background. A figure of devotion, but never of leadership. But what if that version was just a mask? What if another story once existed and was erased? That's what the Gospel of Mary begins to suggest. An ancient manuscript found in a 5th century papyrus, part of the Berlin Gnostic Codex. It's incomplete. Only the middle portion remains. But even that fragment is enough to completely challenge the collective memory of early Christianity. In this gospel, Mary isn't on the sidelines. She speaks directly with Jesus after his resurrection, while the male disciples cower in fear and doubt. She understands his symbolic teachings in a way others don't. And even more, she receives something extraordinary, a personal revelation, knowledge passed on beyond what the others could see or hear. And that's exactly what triggered conflict. When Mary shares what she was told, it's the male disciples, especially Peter, who push back. One passage quotes him as saying, "Did the teacher really speak privately with a woman and not to us? Are we to listen to her? Did she claim to see angels?" That question, and on the surface, just a personal objection, reveals a deeper structural tension. Who gets to speak on behalf of God? And even more dangerously, can a woman hold that right? The Church's long-term answer was clear: no, because if the Gospel of Mary had been accepted as legitimate, it would have opened up an entirely different spiritual history, one where women weren't just followers but leaders, not just recipients of salvation, but receivers of divine knowledge, guides of the soul, bearers of sacred connection. That reality was impossible to reconcile with a church system built by and for male authority. And so Mary Magdalene's image was rewritten. From a spiritual leader to a redeemed prostitute, from Jesus' most trusted confidant to a symbol of weakness needing rescue. And her gospel, erased from canon, labeled heresy, buried in silence for over 1,000 years. Only in modern times, as scholars began re-examining ancient manuscripts, did people start to realize half of the spiritual story may have been deliberately erased, not because Mary was wrong, but because she was right, at the wrong time. A time when women were forced to be silent, seen as unreliable, considered unworthy of holding sacred knowledge. But what she taught about death, the soul, and returning to the source carried stunning philosophical depth. She described the human soul not as something judged by sin, but as something tested by layers of energy, desire, ignorance, anger. And that salvation was a personal journey of recognition and release, not blind obedience. That kind of worldview centered on personal awakening, not collective submission, was bound to be seen as a threat. And when we look back now, we can't help but ask, If Mary Magdalene was truly the one chosen to carry forward the spiritual path, what kind of church history could have been written instead? If women once held spiritual authority, what happened that stripped them of it for thousands of years after? We may not have all the answers, but one thing is clear. The Gospel of Mary didn't vanish because it was meaningless. It vanished because it was too meaningful. And now that meaning is rising again, and with it, not just the dignity of one woman, but the truth that an entire system may have built its legacy on an incomplete and possibly inaccurate story. If the story of religion were a carefully staged play, then Judas Iscariot has always held the role of the perfect villain, the man who betrayed Jesus, sealing their friendship with a kiss in exchange for 30 pieces of silver. That image has been burned into our collective memory for over 2,000 years, I rarely questioned. But what if the story isn't that simple? What if Judas didn't betray Jesus, but obeyed him? What if the crucifixion wasn't a tragic accident, but a sacred plan, and Judas was the only one chosen to carry it out? That's exactly what the Gospel of Judas suggests, and that's also why it was erased from history. Discovered in the 1970s in a Coptic manuscript, this Gospel caused a shockwave because it retells the final days of Jesus not from the perspective of a victim, but from the man history branded as the traitor. In this version, Jesus doesn't condemn Judas. In fact, he trusts him more than anyone. He shares with Judas deep spiritual truths about the universe, the origin of the soul, and the hidden forces behind existence. And in the end, he asks Judas to do the unthinkable, to help free his soul from the prison of flesh, not betrayal, but sacrifice. If that's true, the entire foundation of Christian theology around betrayal, forgiveness, and sin gets flipped. Judas, once seen as the symbol of treachery, becomes the one disciple who truly understood the Master's mission, and more than that, he's the one who chose to be hated forever so that a greater spiritual event could unfold. That was too much for the church to accept, because if Judas could be redeemed, then the neat categories of good versus evil, saint versus sinner, loyal versus traitor, all collapse. Salvation would no longer be about following rules, but about understanding deep spiritual purpose. And once again, that would undermine control. In the Gospel of Judas, Jesus laughs, not in mockery but in sorrow, at the disciples who misunderstand him. He tells Judas that most people worship a false god, a lesser being who demands blood offerings and rules through fear. Only Judas, with his insight and courage, can help free Jesus' soul from the physical realm of bondage. This isn't just a theological disruption, it's a radical shift in how we see truth, loyalty, and human perception. It suggests that real truth might not always be written in plain text, and that history's greatest traitor may have accepted the darkest role so that others could find the light. And that's precisely why this gospel was never included in the Bible. At the Council of Nicaea and other early church councils, the Gospel of Judas, along with dozens of other Gnostic texts, was branded heresy. Not because it was illogical, but because it was too logical in a very inconvenient direction. It offered a version of faith that couldn't be controlled through rituals or fear. It proposed something dangerous, that each person is responsible for the truth they come to understand. Not obedience saves you, but insight liberates you. And if people start thinking that way, the whole system, built on sermons, confession, and forgiveness, begins to fade. The Gospel of Judas didn't disappear, it was sealed away, hidden in the shadows. And when it was finally published in 2006, the response was mostly skepticism. not because of a lack of evidence, but because it struck too close to a sacred symbol. But maybe that's exactly why we should take it seriously. Because if Judas, the betrayer, was actually the only one who truly understood the spiritual path Jesus had to walk, then how many others in history have been condemned, misunderstood, or erased simply because they chose a path the rest of the world wasn't ready to understand? And if truth doesn't belong to the majority, how many faces has history painted wrong? How many souls have carried centuries of shame, not because they failed, but because they knew too much? In the long and eerie history of so-called cursed books, one manuscript stands above all others, not just for its massive size, but for a single haunting image, a hand-drawn devil taking up an entire page, staring blankly at the reader with lifeless eyes. This is Codex Gigas, known to many as the Devil's Bible, but what makes it truly strange isn't just the image, it's the fact that Codex Gigas still exists. It was never burned, never banned. In fact, it's carefully preserved, like a national treasure, inside the National Library of Sweden. So the question is why? If this really were a book of the devil, why didn't the Church destroy it, the way it burned thousands of Gnostic writings, heretical scriptures, and magical texts during the Middle Ages? Why was this symbol of evil allowed to survive? Why protect it while erasing texts about the soul, spiritual awakening, and personal liberation? What is it about Codex Gigas that instills fear, but not destruction? Written in the early 13th century, Codex Gigas is the largest surviving medieval manuscript, nearly a meter tall, over 70 kilograms, more than 300 pages of calfskin. It contains the full Latin Bible Vulgate, but also much more: astronomical charts, medical recipes, curses, a catalogue of supernatural beings, and, perhaps most shockingly, a collection of summoning rituals, all written in the same script as if by one single hand. And then there's the legend. A monk, sentenced to death inside his monastery, begs for forgiveness. He promises to create a book of all human knowledge in a single night. And when he realizes he can't finish in time, he makes a pact with the devil. It's a haunting story, but like most legends, it masks a deeper truth, the fear we don't want to face, so we turn it into myth. Because the real discomfort with Codex Gigas isn't the devil's portrait, it's the coexistence of what's sacred and what's forbidden. Inside this one manuscript, a complete Bible sits side by side with alchemy, medicine, astrology, and summoning rites. Nothing is separated. Nothing is off limits. That alone breaks the boundary the Church spent centuries trying to enforce. What belongs to God and what belongs to the devil. In Codex Gigas, those worlds don't oppose each other. They intertwine. And that, not the demon drawing, is what made it unacceptable. Codex Gigas was labeled a devil's book, but it stayed in the hands of power. It was kept in the Benedictine monastery of Bohemia. Later, it was taken by the Swedish army during the 30 Years' War, but through it all, no one burned it. No one dared to destroy it. Why? Because deep down, maybe they knew, this wasn't a book of black magic. It was a book of knowledge, a guide to the old world, Urshalti, where medicine, astronomy, the soul, and even faith were one interconnected system, not broken up, not controlled, not filtered. If the medical texts inside it were taken seriously, they could change how we understand ancient healing. If the astronomical notes were fully decoded, they might reveal how early people observed the cosmos, not through telescopes, but through symbolic insight and spiritual patterns. And if the summoning rituals were seen not as evil spells, but as psychological blueprints, then Codex Gigas stops being a book of demons. It becomes a map of the human mind, a manual for confronting the shadows within ourselves. But if that knowledge is accepted, what happens to the Church's monopoly on truth? That's why Codex Gigas was never burned. But it was never celebrated either. It was tucked away, not to be forgotten completely, but never to be taken too seriously. It became a symbol, not of understanding, but of warning. Don't go near it, not because it's dangerous, but because if you understand it, you might stop believing in the lines they drew for you. A book drawn to look like it belongs to the devil, but filled with the lost wisdom of humanity. Perhaps the most carefully hidden piece of the Church's own suppressed archive. So when we ask, why wasn't the devil burned with the book? Maybe the answer is simple, because the devil was only a symbol of everything that power could not control. They were never afraid of the devil. They were afraid you might read and understand. History, they say, is written by the victors, but sometimes the most profound truths aren't found in victory. They're found in quiet withdrawal. And in this search for hidden wisdom, there's one group nearly wiped from every textbook, every sermon, every official record: the Essenes, a silent, reclusive community that lived on the edges of two of the most powerful forces of their time, Judaism and the Roman Empire. They didn't fight, they didn't preach, they didn't try to convert, but that silence may have been what made them so feared. So, who were the Essenes? According to ancient writers like Pliny the Elder, Josephus, and a few Greek historians, the Essenes were a tightly knit group who lived communally, gave up personal property, practiced celibacy, followed strict vegetarian diets, and kept their bodies and spirits pure. They lived in the desert wilderness of Qumran near the Dead Sea, at the heart of a world consumed by religious conflict, political tension, and imperial occupation. And it was there, nearly 2,000 years later, that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, a treasure trove of ancient manuscripts believed to have been written and preserved by the Essenes themselves. This wasn't just an archaeological discovery, it was a revelation of suppressed wisdom, because within those scrolls were teachings, descriptions, and spiritual insights that clashed sharply with the official religious narratives we know today, not because they were rebellious, but because they were too deep to control. The Essenes believed that light didn't come from ritual but from inner purification. They rejected animal sacrifice at the temple, they refused to pay taxes to Rome, they declined to follow the state-sanctioned religious calendar, they chose to live beyond control. And in every era that has always been considered dangerous, so they were erased. While mainstream Judaism became institutionalized and Christianity spread after Jesus' death, the Essenes, who in many ways may have been closest to Jesus' own teachings, were written out of history as if they never existed, not forgotten by accident, forgotten on purpose, because their philosophy was simply too different. They didn't believe the soul needed redemption through sacrifice. They believed the soul already carried light. It just needed to be cleansed through meditation, reflection, and harmony with the universe. They didn't build churches. They didn't collect tithes. They didn't create a priesthood. What they built instead was a peaceful community, one without hierarchy, one without power, and that, to Rome, was a rejection of empire. To Orthodox Judaism, it was heresy. To the later church, it was a past best left buried. No surprise, then, that their manuscripts, beautifully written, deeply philosophical, and filled with complex cosmology, were sealed away for nearly 2 millennia. It wasn't until the 20th century that they were accidentally uncovered. But that's how we came to see the truth. What we call religious history is often a curated slice of something much bigger. And everything else, the parts that can't be easily controlled, got buried Maybe the Essenes knew this. Maybe they understood that their path wouldn't be remembered, wouldn't be honored. So instead of fighting to be heard, they whispered their message into the earth, hidden in scrolls, waiting for a generation willing to listen. And when those scrolls were finally found, what emerged wasn't just knowledge. It was a way of life that once existed. Simple, peaceful, free of power, free of control, free of propaganda. A kind of freedom that needed no declaration, a kind of light that never needed to be lit. Among the hundreds of ancient manuscripts discovered in the Qumran caves, once home to the mysterious Essene community, there's one scroll that stands out from all the rest. It wasn't written on parchment, papyrus, or animal skin. It was etched into metal, cold, heavy, and unyielding copper, a material you'd expect for a weapon or a plaque, not for recording what appears to be a treasure list. But that's exactly what the copper scroll is, and that's exactly why it's surrounded by silence. Discovered in 1952 inside Qumran's Cave 3, the copper scroll contains no prayers, no theology, no philosophy. Instead, it reads like a dry, clinical inventory, listing 64 secret locations where gold, silver, sacred objects, and vast stores of precious metals were supposedly buried. One line reads, "In the third chamber, beneath the white stone, to the north of the old cistern, 42 jars of gold." No metaphors, no symbolism, just a map created by people who clearly knew the value of what they were hiding and knew it couldn't fall into the wrong hands. And that's what made it too dangerous to publish, because if the locations listed on the copper scroll are real, someone out there knows it, has read it, has searched, and made the deliberate choice not to tell the world. The question is why? One common theory ties the treasure to the temple in Jerusalem, particularly to sacred objects hidden from the Holy of Holies before its destruction by the Romans in 70 CE. If true, the copper scroll isn't just a ledger, it's a key, one that could reopen the door to an ancient spiritual order lost to time. Whoever finds that treasure could hold the most powerful religious symbols in the Levant, not just in terms of gold or silver, but political and divine authority. And no nation, no religious body would want that falling into the wrong hands. Over the decades, various teams have tried to excavate sites based on the scroll's instructions. But strangely, nearly every effort has been blocked, permits denied, sites declared military zones, excavations stopped due to lack of archaeological basis. The result? The copper scroll, though translated, published, and widely studied, still remains untouched, visible but out of reach. And that raises a deeper question. Maybe the real secret isn't the treasure itself, but the fact that it exists. There's something else. Unlike the other Dead Sea scrolls filled with spiritual teachings or historical records, the copper scroll uses a completely different tone, precise, emotionless, almost coded. Some place names no longer exist, others have changed over time. But the descriptions are still painfully specific, as if the writer knew that one day someone would come looking, not sooner, not later, at the right time. So who is that person, and when is that time? Maybe the copper scroll isn't just a map to buried wealth, but a map of faith, created not so everyone could find it, but to test who was truly worthy to try. And that's why the world can see it, but no one is allowed to touch it. The real question isn't, is the treasure real? The real question is, who gets to decide whether it should be found? If it does exist, then its power isn't just in the gold, it's in what it represents, a spiritual legacy hidden by people who lived, guarded, and possibly died not to protect riches, but to protect a memory of an ancient faith that modern civilization might not be ready to receive. And if that's true, then the copper scroll isn't just etched metal, it's a message from the past, left for a future brave enough to answer, a question still waiting, and one no one has dared to answer. In the darkest ages of medieval Europe, where faith was caged inside doctrine and truth passed through the lips of a single religious class, a quiet flame once flickered in the distance. A philosophy whispered like a lonely star in a long night. It was called Hermetica, a small collection of ancient texts and yet powerful enough to shake the very foundation of spiritual authority. Its message was simple but dangerous. Human beings can understand the universe, not through miracles, but through reason. Not by divine favor, but through inner awakening. And that idea, brief as it was enough to get Hermetica buried for centuries. Hermetica is a body of philosophical writings said to carry the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary figure, half myth, half symbol, the fusion of Hermes, the Greek messenger god, and Thoth, the Egyptian deity of wisdom and writing. His name means thrice great, and in that title is a statement. Hermes was not only a messenger, but a philosopher, an astrologer, and a mystic, a man who unified all three paths to divine understanding. And that unity is exactly what made him a threat to every system built on division. Because in Hermetica, there's no wall between science and the soul, no war between matter and spirit, no contradiction between logic and faith. On the contrary, everything is connected by one invisible thread. All is one. The universe is alive. And if a human trains both mind and soul, if they listen deeply enough, they can understand its rhythm, the pulse of creation itself. That belief that spiritual insight and intellectual curiosity are one and the same was dangerous to any system trying to control through fragmentation. The Church couldn't allow a philosophy that claimed people could access the divine without intermediaries, a worldview that said the soul doesn't need to beg, it needs to know itself. In one of Hermetica's most famous lines, Hermes writes, "He who knows himself knows the all." That's not just moral advice, it's a declaration of human inner power, and to any authority built on submission, that was unforgivable. After the Council of Nicaea, Hermetic texts were slowly labeled heresy. Its ties to ancient Egyptian wisdom made it easy to dismiss as pagan. Instead of being studied as philosophy, Hermetica was locked away in the dungeon of suspicion, vanishing from Western academia for centuries. And yet, in the shadows, it survived, carried through the Islamic Golden Age, echoed in the alchemy of the Renaissance, resurfacing in the writings of pioneers like Giordano Bruno, Marsilio Ficino, and even Isaac Newton, the very man we know as the father of physics, who spent most of his life studying not just gravity, but Hermetica and alchemical philosophy. So why were the founders of modern science so drawn to a philosophy once labeled superstition? Because they understood Hermetica isn't magic, it's symbolic language for deeper laws. Laws that don't stop at the surface, but go down to the essence. When Hermes says, as above, so below, he isn't just talking about astrology. He's describing a universal symmetry, that the patterns of the cosmos reflect the structures within the human being, a thought that is at once spiritual and scientific, if we're willing to look closely. But because Hermetica was too layered, too unified, too hard to control, it was boxed up as esoteric, then pushed aside and finally called heretical, while simpler, more submissive ideas were preserved because they were easier to rule with. Hermetica never taught people to obey. It taught them to observe, not to believe blindly, but to ignite understanding. And that was the real threat. Today, Hermetica is little more than a strange word to most people. But if we trace the footsteps of history's great thinkers, from Leonardo da Vinci to Newton, from Paracelsus to Copernicus, we find many of them quietly shaped by Hermetic thought. Not because they were mystics, but because Hermetica offered something that dogma could not: wholeness. A knowledge that didn't force us to choose between science and spirit, between logic and wonder. A truth that was buried because, in its fullness, it was too powerful to allow. In modern minds, the word magic conjures images of shadowy rituals, cryptic spells, and robed figures mumbling in candlelit rooms. But in the ancient world, magic meant something very different. It was a name for unclassified knowledge, the kind that existed between science and spirit, between symbols and experiment. And among the texts most aggressively labeled as evil, shunned by religion, but secretly shaping the foundation of Western civilization, no name is more mysterious or more feared than Picatrix. Originally written in Arabic in the 10th century under the title Gayat al-Hakam, the aim of the sage, Picatrix is a massive compilation of wisdom drawn from Babylon, Egypt, Greece, and the Islamic world. It's not just a book of magic, it's a cosmic encyclopedia. Inside you'll find knowledge of astrology, ancient medicine, alchemy, symbolic psychology, meditative practice, and the subtle ways energy moves through both the body and the universe. In short, Picatrix is a handbook for the ecosystem of the soul. And that's why it was labeled sorcery. Not because it was irrational, but because it was too rational in a direction that couldn't be controlled. When the text was translated into Latin in the 12th century, it spread quietly across Europe. But instead of entering universities or church libraries, it was pushed to the margins, passed hand to hand among alchemists, astrologers, and scholars chasing truths beyond doctrine. Ironically, some of the most respected thinkers of the Renaissance studied Picatrix, including Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and even Johannes Kepler, the father of modern astronomy. But they rarely admitted it, because Picatrix wasn't welcome in the light of religious orthodoxy. Inside are passages on using geometry, colors, music, sense, and symbols to affect the mind and body, ideas that today are echoed in neuroscience, sensory therapy, and modern psychology. Each chapter explores how consciousness interacts with the cosmos, using metaphors and imagery that, far from being superstitious, reveal a structured and symbolic understanding of planetary cycles, light, and psychological energy. The most dangerous idea in Picatrix wasn't a spell, it was this: that a human being can connect to the universe directly, without priesthood, without fear, without submission. It said, you don't need to beg the heavens, you can harmonize with them. You can change your inner world, not by trembling in prayer, but by tuning breath, light, sound, and intention. To the church and the monarchies of medieval Europe, that was unacceptable. Knowledge like that had to be buried, branded dark magic, not to destroy its truth, but to surround it in fear. They didn't need to burn the book, they just had to make sure you were afraid to read it. And that strategy worked. For centuries, Picatrix was hidden in private libraries, read in whispers by those brave enough to ask, but too afraid to speak openly. Today, when we read Picatrix, what shocks us isn't how magical it is to read, but how rational it feels. It doesn't ask you to believe, it asks you to observe, to experiment. A mindset strikingly close to modern science, but expressed in symbolic language, because at that time, science and spirit were not yet divided. And that's what Picatrix ultimately reminds us. There was once a time when science and soul were one. We only split them apart when power needed truth to fit inside a box, a box it could control. There's something strange about how human history has preserved its deepest knowledge. The oldest, most profound ideas weren't passed down through lectures or sermons, but through symbols, diagrams, and rituals. Not because ancient people were superstitious, but maybe because they understood something we've forgotten. Some truths can't be spoken. They can only be experienced through symbolism. And if there's one book that holds the densest system of ancient symbols, where math, geometry, and the soul merge into one, it might be the Key of Solomon. The name sounds like a myth or a folktale, but inside lies a complex system. Circles, stars, strange alphabets, charts, and ceremonial instructions. Things that look at first glance like the tools of sorcerers. But when you look closer, a deeper question emerges: is this really magic? Or is it a symbolic language for ancient knowledge, twisted over centuries into something it never was? The Key of Solomon first appeared in Latin and Greek manuscripts during the Middle Ages, but it's believed to be far older, possibly rooted in Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, or even ancient Egypt. Legend says King Solomon, considered the wisest man in the Bible, used the book to summon invisible entities, command spirits, build temples, and understand the laws of both material and spiritual realms. Sounds like folklore. But if it's just a legend, then why were thousands of handwritten copies passed across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa for 1,000 years? If it's just superstition, then why do its symbols so closely resemble the sacred geometry used by Pythagoras, Plato, and temple architects of the ancient world? Maybe the truth is this: the Key of Solomon doesn't contain black magic. It contains symbolic knowledge, knowledge that was branded as heresy to prevent people from understanding it. Inside the book are geometric sigils, 5-pointed stars, 6-pointed stars, 8-pointed stars, each paired with names, tones, and syllables. Some call this spirit summoning, but from a modern view of acoustics and wave geometry, this could very well be a coded system for resonance-based information. Put simply, if you replace the word magic with frequency and replace summoning with communication, then the Key of Solomon starts to look less like witchcraft and more like an early interface for human consciousness and subtle energy systems. And that's why it was twisted. In a world where only the Church had the authority to define truth, there was no room for a non-doctrinal system, especially not one attributed to a king who dared to speak to invisible forces without permission. So the Key of Solomon was pushed into the underground, read in secret, copied in silence, and over time its original meaning was lost. Its symbols, once meant to represent harmony between human and universe, became seen as curses. Its rituals, once symbolic acts of inner focus, were reframed as dark magic. No one asked, what if the entities Solomon summoned weren't spirits from the outside, but states of consciousness from within? What if the sacred circles and star patterns were visual tools, ancient models of how the brain changes when it accesses higher awareness? And if so, then what we've called forbidden sorcery might actually be a forgotten map, leading back to inner knowledge modern society no longer understands. Today, researchers in symbolic psychology, sacred geometry, and conscious architecture are beginning to see what others missed. The symbols in the Key of Solomon aren't random. They follow mathematical structure, they direct human attention, they shift perception. And if that's true, then the Key of Solomon isn't the book of a sorcerer. It's a conceptual device, intentionally mislabeled by power structures to keep you away from something you were always meant to understand. A book once said to belong to a king, but banned not because it was wrong, but because it didn't need permission to work. It gives people the power to know themselves without asking anyone's permission. The world is full of ancient manuscripts. Strange, symbolic, difficult to understand. Most of them, no matter how cryptic, eventually yield something: a deciphered passage, a decoded purpose, a hint of who wrote them and why. But there is one book that stands alone. For over 600 years it has puzzled the most brilliant minds. Not because it's too complex, but because no one even knows what it is. It's called the Voynich manuscript. It's written in a script no one has ever seen before. No known civilization used it. There is no reference alphabet, no author, no origin, no readable words. Alongside these unreadable lines are drawings of plants that don't exist, astrological charts that don't match any known sky, and diagrams of the female body, surrounded by mysterious, almost mystical elements. But the most unsettling thing about the Voynich manuscript isn't what's inside. It's that no one has ever cracked it. And more importantly, those who come close are often asked to stop. Why? The manuscript first appeared in the 15th century, written with advanced ink on high-quality vellum. It came to light in 1912, when a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich discovered it and gave it his name. Since then, the book has become an obsession. Linguists, cryptographers, even World War II intelligence agencies have tried to decode it. Some speculated it hides ancient medical knowledge. Others think it holds secret alchemical formulas, or even forbidden history. What's strange is that the deeper scholars dig, the more structured the language appears. The script has syllabic patterns, words repeat in recognizable rhythms. There's grammar. It behaves exactly like a real language, just one that no one has ever spoken. There's only one thing missing: a speaker. No matching script has been found anywhere else, no bilingual translation, no known culture has left any trace of using this writing system. That's led some researchers to ask, what if this was a language designed to be hidden? And if so, who had the authority to bury it? Some bold theories suggest the Voynich manuscript holds ancient knowledge about herbal medicine, female biology, or prehistoric astronomy, all things that didn't fit within the allowed mindset of medieval Europe. Others say it might have been written for a civilization we haven't even recognized yet. But, strangely, whenever someone gets close to cracking the code, their research is cut off. Access to the original manuscript gets restricted. Independent scholars are denied permission to study it. Excuses are given. Preservation? Technical standards? Not enough credentials. But quietly, it feels like someone doesn't want this book to be understood, because if it is understood, people might discover that what's in the Voynich manuscript was once real knowledge, knowledge that was deliberately removed from official history, knowledge that never made it into textbooks, because it didn't serve the institutions that controlled what became truth. Imagine this: a civilization that knew how to heal using plants without chemicals, that could track biological cycles through astronomy, that knew how to shift human consciousness using symbol, rhythm, and geometry. And all of it was encoded in one book. Then hiding that book would make sense. And maybe that's why the Voynich manuscript has never been decoded, only surrounded by rumor, because when you can't burn a book, the next best way to hide it is to convince the world it's nonsense. Today, the manuscript sits behind glass in Yale University's Beinecke Library, on display as a mystery. But behind that glass, a deeper question lingers. If it's just a hoax, why does it follow the structure of a real language? And if it's not a hoax, what kind of knowledge is still hidden in its pages? The book says nothing. But in its long, enduring silence, through 6 centuries of confusion, it may be telling us something louder than any translation. Some secrets aren't lost. They're kept. not so that no one knows, but so that only a few ever will. You. There are texts that don't preach fear, no threats of hell, no promises of heaven, no divine punishment or reward, just quiet, thoughtful question about the soul, about human nature, and about where we truly belong in the universe. These are not books that seek to control, they invite us to think, and that, ironically, is what makes them so dangerous to any system built on fear and obedience. The Corpus Hermeticum is one of those texts. This compact collection of ancient writings, regarded as the core of Hermetic philosophy, it may be small, but if truly understood, it has the power to collapse entire theologies. It first appeared between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, though it drew heavily from much older Egyptian and Greek spiritual traditions. It presents itself as dialogues between Hermes Trismegistus and his disciples, conversations about the soul, the origin of the cosmos, and how human beings can be reborn through inner understanding, not ritual. No blessings, no final judgment, no priests standing between you and the divine. Just a question. Who are you, and why are you here? And for a church that was building its authority on hierarchy and salvation through obedience, that was a threat they could not control. The first known manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum arrived in Florence from Constantinople in the 15th century, right as Europe was shifting from the medieval era into the Renaissance. When it landed in the hands of Marsilio Ficino, a respected scholar under the patronage of the Medici family, he believed he had found something older than Plato, more primal than the Bible, and that terrified the church. Ficino wasn't a rebel, he was well regarded, but when he elevated Hermeticism as sacred philosophy, a complete spiritual framework for the soul and cosmos, it directly challenged the Bible's dominance as the single source of divine truth. In the Corpus Hermeticum, human beings don't need to be saved. They simply need to remember who they are. The fall of man isn't about sin, it's about forgetting our divine origin, and salvation isn't something granted by an external deity. It's an inner awakening from the illusions of the material world. This philosophy teaches no submission, no begging for mercy, no dependency on sacred authority. And in the eyes of an emerging power structure built on cathedrals, clergy, and canon law, that was unacceptable. So the Corpus Hermeticum was not burned, it was quietly removed from libraries, from lectures, from public consciousness. It survived only in secret societies among alchemists and in the margins of forgotten manuscripts. Some parts were lost, some altered, some preserved only through scattered quotations. No public bans were needed, everyone understood. This was not to be talked about. But if you read the Corpus Hermeticum closely, you'll find no rebellion, only peace, a peace that comes from within. It doesn't judge, it doesn't divide good and evil into rigid boxes. It simply offers a path, understand and be free. Hermes writes, what is above is reflected in what is below, and what is below is the gateway to what is above. It's not a spell, it's a cosmological principle. The idea that all things are connected, that to know yourself is to know the universe. And in an era when the church claimed exclusive authority over truth, that idea was far too radical to let loose. So the Corpus Hermeticum wasn't banned. It was silenced, deliberately and effectively. It still exists, but no one teaches it. No one asks, if this was once the wisdom of ancient minds, why was it abandoned? And if it wasn't dangerous, why was it hidden? Maybe because it says something too simple, too clear. And that makes it terrifying to any system built on control, that you don't need power to connect with the divine. You only need to look within and remember you are always light. When people think about hidden texts, their minds usually jump to religious scriptures, secret manuscripts, or scrolls burned during crusades. But there's another kind of knowledge that rarely gets mentioned, not because it's too mysterious, but because it feels too ordinary to seem dangerous. We're talking about tiny clay tablets, rectangular, rough around the edges, no prophecies, no summoning rituals, no treasure maps or cosmic codes, just kids' homework from Babylon over 4,000 years ago. Sounds basic, right? But it's that very simplicity, once you take a closer look, that reveals something kind of unsettling for modern education, because these kids were being taught things that we've mostly forgotten. And when you line up these clay tablets next to today's school curriculums, one painful question starts to surface. Are we really making progress, or losing something we used to understand perfectly? These school tablets were found in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities like Nippur, and Babylon. Thousands of them contain lessons in cuneiform writing, multiplication tables, geometry problems, and, believe it or not, how to divide up public land. The kids, mostly from families of administrators, merchants, and priests, were taught how to measure farmland, allocate resources, record contracts, and even how to argue logically. Not just memorization, real education for running a society. Some tablets explain how to divide land fairly after floods. Others show how to calculate crop yields based on the lunar calendar and weather. There are even records of penalties for cheating in trade, listing the exact amount of silver you had to pay back. Not dogma, not empty theory. This was education as a tool for justice and economics. So here's the awkward question. If this knowledge was so clear, so practical, and so ahead of its time, why don't we learn about it in modern history books? Why do we know so much about Pythagoras, but almost nothing about how Babylonian school kids were learning square roots 1,000 years before he was born? Maybe it's because that would force us to rethink everything we assume about the evolution of knowledge. It would mean admitting that some ancient societies taught their kids to think like grown-ups. It would mean facing the idea that maybe we're not actually moving forward, just walking in circles. And that idea, within a modern education system designed to feed the market and reward obedience, is uncomfortable. Because in those tablets, people didn't just find numbers and assignments, they found a way of thinking, one that didn't split theory from practice, one that didn't treat learning as a separate path, but as the operating system for everyday life. Kids were taught how to manage grain warehouses, how to settle civil disputes, how to measure the distance between a river and the nearest village, how to keep order in society. No grades, no college entrance exams, just one goal: understand how the world works. And the sad irony, that very simple efficiency might be the reason Babylon's education system gets ignored today, because to accept it, we'd have to face some tough questions. Why do today's kids study for over a decade and still not understand how society functions? Why do we separate math from real life, history from the present, logic from ethics? And why has education, once meant to serve the community, become something that divides, ranks, and excludes? Maybe that's why these tablets, even though they were never burned or banned, were quietly buried in silence. No one calls them forbidden knowledge, but no one's teaching their spirit anymore either. No one destroyed the tablets. But no one is letting kids today really touch what they once stood for. In almost every ancient civilization, there was always a certain kind of figure, someone both revered and feared, the one who could see the future. Not a fortune teller, not a magician, but someone, or sometimes a whole lineage, with the power to speak prophetic truth. And these weren't words meant to scare or comfort. They were commands, once spoken There was no going back. In ancient Rome, those prophecies were locked inside a set of books, sealed, guarded, and only opened when the empire was on the edge of collapse. They were called the Sibylline books. Now, at first glance, they sound like some kind of religious text, but in reality, they were Rome's top-tier strategic documents. No one, except a select council, was allowed near them. You couldn't read them out of curiosity. You couldn't question them out of skepticism. Only when Rome faced massive crisis, a deadly plague, a natural disaster, a full-scale war, or even a spiritual breakdown, would the priests quietly unlock the cabinet, consult the Sibylline books, and deliver the will of the gods. But here's the thing, no one ever got to hear the actual prophecy, only the conclusion. Never the original words, only the command, never the reason. And just like that, prophecy became a tool, twisted and shaped by those in power. According to legend, the Sibylline books were first offered to King Tarquinius by a mysterious woman named Sibyl. She asked a huge price for all 9 volumes. When the king refused, she burned 3. Came back, same price for the remaining 6. He refused again. She burned 3 more. With only 3 left, the king panicked and paid full price. Those last 3 became Rome's most sacred treasure, stored in the Capitoline temple, guarded by elite sentinels. No one dared destroy them, but no one dared reveal them either, until one day, Rome did it themselves. In 83 BC, the temple caught fire. The Sibylline books went up in flames. Official story? Accident. But almost immediately afterward, the Roman Senate ordered a reconstruction, gathering prophecies from across the ancient world. Greece, Asia Minor, even Egyptian temples. They edited, rewrote, discarded, and created a new version, one that was approved. What does that tell us? That the right to know the future has never belonged to the people. That prophecy, when too accurate or too inconvenient, gets rewritten to fit the agenda. From then on, the Sibylline books weren't used to warn, they were used to justify. Building a new temple, consult the books. Changing a ritual, the books approve. Declaring war, it's divine will. What began as a voice from the heavens became a stamp of human politics. Today, not a single original Sibylline book survives. All of them were destroyed or lost. What we have are late copies, second-hand quotes, scattered footnotes in Roman historians' texts, and a whole lot of blank space. No one really knows what the original prophecies said. What we do know is this: they were selectively rewritten, edited, and in the end, burned. Not because they were wrong, but maybe because they were too right at the wrong time. Maybe what Sibyl said wasn't what power wanted to hear. Maybe it didn't serve war, didn't promote worship, didn't paint a glorious destiny. Maybe all it did was remind us that power doesn't last, that every empire is temporary, that what comes from the earth returns to the earth. And words like that, once written down, simply aren't allowed to survive. History is usually told through a familiar template, a single beginning, one creator, one first couple, and from there the world takes shape. But here's something people rarely talk about. Not every civilization agreed with that story. Across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, creation didn't follow just one script. These weren't alternative versions, they were completely different worldviews. And deep in the jungles of Central America, one civilization passed down its own creation story, not in ink, not carved in stone, but through spoken word, for generations. Until one day those words were burned to ashes, and only one fragile piece made it through the fire. That piece is called the Popol Vuh. To the Maya people, the Popol Vuh wasn't just a book, it was memory, ancestral truth, a direct line to the beginning, without any middleman, without any priesthood telling them how it should sound. And that's exactly why, when the Spanish arrived, they didn't just conquer land, they tried to erase memory. The Popol Vuh doesn't open with an all-powerful God. It begins in silence. No light, no people, no earth. Just the creators, talking about how to bring humans into being. But they failed many times. First, they made people from mud, too soft, then wood, no soul. It wasn't until they used corn, the sacred food of the Maya, that they finally succeeded. No original sin, no eternal fall, just trial, error, learning, and evolution. And that made it a threat to the ideology brought from Europe. When Spanish missionaries came to Central America in the 1500s, they didn't just build churches, they gathered and burned every native document, carving, and story they could find. Father Diego de Landa, in a proud moment of cultural cleansing, once bragged about burning over 40 handwritten texts he deemed heretical, one of which may have been the earliest copy of the Popol Vuh. Ironically, the book survived because of another priest, one who, out of curiosity or compassion, secretly copied the elders' oral version and translated it into Spanish. That's how the Popol Vuh lived on. Not in its original form, but just enough to still hear its ancient voice. So what did it say that scared people so much? It didn't praise a single almighty God. It told the journey of two heroic twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, who ventured into the underworld and overcame darkness, not through brute force, but through cleverness, patience, and grit. It wasn't a myth about obedience, it was about memory, courage, and resilience, a story that taught humans aren't judged by gods. They face trials to understand themselves, and to those building a religion based on punishment and salvation. That message was dangerous. The Popol Vuh never used the word sin. It spoke of imbalance with nature, no eternal hell, no single path to redemption. Every soul had its own journey. Every mistake could be fixed. And maybe that's why it had to burn. Not just for what it said, but for what it stood for. An independent philosophy, a moral compass that didn't need a church. A universe where no one was born guilty or holy. Just human, trying to find balance again. Today, the Popol Vuh only survives as a copy of a copy. But in its faded lines, we still hear a world that was stolen, not because it was savage, not because it was wrong, but because it didn't need permission to exist. It didn't need Adam, it didn't need Eve. All it needed was corn, the food that fed both body and soul. Not every forbidden book was banned because it clashed with religion, and not every hidden piece of knowledge was buried because it was wrong. Some books weren't burned. They were quietly shelved, left untouched, avoided, not because they were full of dark magic, but because their logic didn't fit into the boxes of their time. One of those books, long labeled a demon's book and forgotten for nearly 400 years, is the Book of Soiga. Nobody really knows who wrote it. No one's even sure that Soiga is its real name. All we know is that it showed up in the private library of John Dee, mathematician, astrologer, alchemist, and the most trusted advisor to Queen Elizabeth I of England. Back then, John Dee was thought to be the smartest man in all of Europe. He spoke multiple languages, wrote hundreds of works on astronomy, math, cartography, and philosophy. He even helped shape the idea of the British Empire with his geopolitical theories and expansionist vision. But what fascinated him the most wasn't found in a university or observatory. It was hidden inside a small, strange book, written in Latin and filled with hundreds of mathematical tables that no one could understand. Its name, Soiga. Or, as Dee believed, a book written by angels. The Book of Soiga wasn't a book of prophecy. It wasn't your typical book of spells either. Its pages were filled with square-shaped letter charts, arranged in patterns resembling ancient ciphers. There were over 36 tables, each with 36 rows, each row made of 36 characters, a precise matrix-like structure that didn't seem random at all. Dee believed these charts contained the secret laws of life, death, and the architecture of the soul. And since he couldn't crack the code himself, he turned to angels. According to his notes, Dee and his colleague Edward Kelly performed hundreds of ritual sessions, not to summon demons, but to communicate with what they called Enochian angels. Dee believed only they could decode the book, because Soiga, he claimed, was written in a divine language only angels could understand. When he asked, "Can anyone but the angels comprehend Soiga?" one entity answered, "No one can understand it fully except God." That's not superstition, that's philosophy. But back then, in an era where both the church and the crown controlled the flow of knowledge, the idea of a respected scholar turning to angels for research was unacceptable. After Dee died, Soiga disappeared. Nobody talked about it. Nobody searched for it. It was gone. Until nearly 400 years later, in 1994, when a scholar named Deborah Harkness stumbled upon 2 surviving copies of Soiga tucked away in the libraries of Oxford and the British Library. Her discovery caused a ripple of curiosity among historians and mathematicians. But strangely, even with today's computers, the codes inside Soiga still haven't been fully cracked, not because they're too complex, but because they don't fit any known cryptographic or logical system. Which raises a tough question. If Dee was wrong, how do the tables still show near-perfect symmetry down to the last letter? But if he was right, then who created this language 400 years before modern math could even describe it? Some think Soiga is a symbolic system, like Eastern mandalas, where geometry isn't just decoration but a mirror of the soul and the universe. But while mandalas are respected, Soiga got branded the devil's book. Why? Maybe because it wasn't in the Bible, maybe because it didn't make sense to most people, but maybe, or and this is the key, because it didn't need permission to exist. Soiga didn't ask, it didn't explain, it didn't define, it just was a riddle that no one dared touch. And in a world where knowledge must always pass through filters of control and authority, a book with no label might be the most dangerous thing of all. Not because it's evil, but because it forces us to rethink everything we believe knowledge is supposed to be. People often say that history is written by the winners, but sometimes history isn't written in the language of victory. It's written in symbols, not in schoolbooks, but hidden in legends, in drawings, in the kinds of things modern society casually labels superstition. And if there's one book that's been dismissed as fantasy for thousands of years, yet might secretly hold a map to a forgotten world, it's the Shanhai Jing, the classic of mountains and seas. To many in modern-day China, Shanhai Jing reads like a bizarre collection of ancient fairy tales, full of strange creatures, impossible places, and unverifiable stories. But for over 2,000 years, from the Han Dynasty to the Ming, this book never disappeared. It was copied, studied, debated, yet no one truly knew what it was. Was it geography, folklore, philosophy in disguise? Or was it a coded record of history, hidden beneath layers of myth to survive censorship? Scholars believe Shanhai Jing first emerged around the 4th century BCE, but its language and ideas seem far older. The full text contains nearly 31,000 characters across 18 chapters, describing more than 500 mountains, 300 rivers, and countless species of animals, plants, people, God, and yes, a wild array of creatures, snakes with human heads, 3-legged birds, fish with tiger faces, humans living in trees. At first glance, it all sounds like pure fantasy. But things got strange when archaeologists and geologists began realizing that some of the places in the book were real. Take Mount Kunlun, for example, long thought to be mythical, but its description matches the Pamir Plateau, home to glaciers that feed many of Asia's great rivers. Some of the creatures described may actually be early, symbolic depictions of forest elephants, rhinos, or rare antelopes. Not nonsense, just recorded in a language of metaphor, not modern science. This got some scholars thinking, what if Shanhai Jing is actually a vast compilation of ancient geographic, ecological, and anthropological knowledge disguised as myth to protect it? Because under the rule of unified Chinese dynasties, where Confucian orthodoxy and imperial control reigned, any knowledge that didn't fit the mold was seen as dangerous. So maybe, just maybe, the guardians of this knowledge retold it as fantasy, so it could survive. If that's true, then Shanhai Jing isn't a book of myth, it's a memory vault encoded in symbols, and that raises some hard questions. Maybe the ancients didn't believe in monsters, they just weren't allowed to describe them scientifically. Maybe the weird people in the book were actually real ethnic groups, now gone or assimilated. Maybe this map wasn't meant to chart political borders, but to show the human relationship with nature. It's no coincidence that many places mentioned lie far from ancient China's central heartland in the southwest, northwest, along the coasts, areas once dismissed as barbarian by imperial eyes. If Shanhai Jing really holds the memories of native civilizations before they were absorbed by Han culture, then labeling it superstition wasn't some innocent mistake. It was a political decision. Because the moment we accept that this book holds real-world knowledge, we're forced to confront something uncomfortable, that China was not always one unified civilization, that there were once other peoples, other myths, other ways of writing, or other kinds of knowledge, and in an education system centered on Confucius, Mencius, and Han dynasty histories, those truths had to be buried, not with fire, but with ridicule. When people think about rewriting history, they usually imagine lines of text being erased, names being changed, or stories being inflated or suppressed. But there's a more subtle way to rewrite history, not by changing what's written, but by making us forget the context it came from. And one of the oldest examples of that kind of editing lies at the foundation of classical Chinese historiography, the Zuozhuan. Zuozhuan, or the Commentary of Zuo, is a historical work that expands on the spring and autumn annals, a brief chronicle of the state of Lu traditionally attributed to Confucius. If the annals were the skeleton, Zuozhuan was the soul, filling in the chaos, the betrayals, the warfare, the ambition, and the constant struggle for power during the spring and autumn period. And that's exactly why, despite being highly respected, Zuozhuan was never fully taught in its raw form, because if you read it closely, you'll realize it's not a book about morals and virtue like so many believed. It's a brutal encyclopedia of how order breaks down. In nearly 260 years of recorded history, Zuozhuan covers over 200 wars, hundreds of assassinations, coups, betrayals, and endless political manipulation among the feudal lords. It tells a story that few want to remember, that the spring and autumn period wasn't a time of noble rulers. It was a time of raw, practical survival where power ruled through cunning and force. And here's the twist, where the book doesn't judge, no glorification, no condemnation. It tells the stories in a cold, detached voice, leaving readers to draw their own conclusions about what happens when power goes unchecked. That honesty, that brutal neutrality, is exactly why later dynasties felt the need to reinterpret it through a Confucian lens. From the Han dynasty onward, China's ruling elites needed a version of history that didn't make people question authority. So they leaned into Confucius, recasting him as the wise sage who stood for order, rituals, and respect for hierarchy. And just like that, Zhuozhuan wasn't treated as a true historical text anymore. It became commentary, a side note, a supplement. Passages about rebellion or coup attempts were either removed or reframed as failures of ritual. Political pragmatism was labelled treason. Kings and emperors were repainted to look like paragons of virtue. History was moralized, reality was reshaped to fit an ideal society. But here's the irony, even Confucius didn't do that. In the spring and autumn annals he wrote sparsely and coldly. Some of the biggest events were described in a single line, no praise, no blame. He understood history should be preserved as it was. It was the later dynasties that turned history into a moral compass, and from there a long tradition of directed history was born. From Zhuozhuan onward, many of China's most famous historical works, like Shiji, the Book of Han, or Ziji Tongjian, included not just facts but judgments, side comments, moral conclusions. Readers weren't allowed to decide for themselves anymore. Every action came pre-labeled: loyal, disloyal, virtuous, wicked. And that mindset still lingers today. No one burned Zhuozhuan, no one banned it, but no one let you read it for what it really is, a raw, unfiltered story of power at work. Instead, it was wrapped up as a book of ethics, a teaching tool, a tidy manual to show the people what's right and what's wrong. But if you read it for real, Zhuozhuan is a harsh mirror, showing what happens when power spins out of control. It's not a sermon on order, it's a record of collapse. And like all dangerous tools, it was carefully repackaged, given new meaning, not erased, not edited, just reinterpreted until nobody remembered how chaotic it once was. Throughout history, some fires didn't just burn paper, they burned entire ways of seeing the world. The ashes left behind weren't just the remains of lost knowledge, they were proof that once there was another way of thinking, another spiritual path, another road to truth, one that didn't go through power or dogma. And one of the most famous, and also most mysterious, of those fires was the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. People often talk about Alexandria as a symbol of ancient civilization. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, thousands of works on philosophy, astronomy, geography, poetry. But what rarely gets mentioned is that among those shelves were Gnostic texts. And those may have been the very reason the flames became inevitable. Gnosticism, from the Greek word gnosis meaning inner knowledge, wasn't a religion. It was a way of thinking. The Gnostic writings didn't teach people to pray or to worship gods in the traditional sense. They taught that the divine spark was already inside us, and our true mission was to wake up and remember who we are. No priest needed, no temple required, no gatekeeper, just turn inward. Gnostic texts described God not as a faraway being, but as a presence beyond description, one who didn't trap the soul in rules and punishment. They believed the material world wasn't perfect. It was a trap, built by flawed entities called archons, whose purpose was to keep us asleep and disconnected from the truth. It was poetic, deep, philosophical, and it posed a direct threat to the rising theology of the early Christian Church. As Christianity became institutionalized under the Roman Empire, early church leaders faced a challenge. How do you create centralized power while still keeping a sense of spirituality? The answer: build a tightly controlled belief system. In that system, Gnosticism was a threat because if anyone could connect to the divine within themselves, what use was a bishop? What use was the church? What use was a hierarchy of holy and unholy? So the Gnostic texts were branded heresy. accused of confusing the true faith, and then hunted down, buried, burned, and the epicenter of this purge, Alexandria. The greatest academic hub of the ancient world, Alexandria didn't just house Greek, Egyptian, and Indian works. It became a meeting point for free-thinking traditions, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Jewish mysticism. In that space, Gnosticism thrived, not as an attack on religion, but as something beyond religion, a mirror turned inward, and that could not be allowed in a world trying to unify faith to stabilize an empire. No one knows for sure who burned the Library of Alexandria. Some say it was Julius Caesar's army, others blame a Christian uprising. Some say it was Caliph Omar during the Muslim conquest of Egypt. Maybe all of them played a part. But what's certain is the Gnostic texts were lost except for a miracle. In 1945, in the Egyptian desert near Nag Hammadi, a sealed jar was found, holding ancient manuscripts that had survived the flames. Thanks to that, we now have fragments of what was lost: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the treatise on the wisdom of Sophia. And within them, quiet voices echo, "The kingdom of God is within you and all around you, not in temples, not in the sky." When you know who you are, you become a child of light. On the surface, these lines seem harmless. But to a system built on hierarchy, rituals, and obedience, they were revolutionary. And so in the flames of Alexandria, it wasn't just books that were destroyed, it was a chance for humanity to learn how to see the divine from within, not through someone else's lens. Today, we've rebuilt that library in concrete and glass, but the words are gone. The ideas once whispered, silenced, not by accident, but by design. When we talk about traditional medicine, people usually think of China, India, or Egypt. Rarely does anyone mention the Americas before Columbus, as if the entire continent was just some wild, knowledgeless place with no healing systems, no science, no written records. But the truth is different, and when that truth was revealed, page by page, it was so powerful, an empire had to burn it to the ground just to deny it ever existed. Because if what the Aztecs knew about plants was ever recognized as real science, then the history of medicine would have to be rewritten from the beginning. And maybe that's exactly why so many Aztec medical texts were deliberately destroyed, not because they were superstition, but because they actually worked. The Aztecs, along with the Nahua, Toltec, and other Mesoamerican civilizations, had a rich, complex medical system. They didn't use the Western term doctor, but they had specialists, diagnosticians, herbalists, midwives, steam therapists, and healers who read both the body and the spirit. At the heart of it all was plants. In manuscripts written in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, there are records of over 300 medicinal plants, each with clearly noted uses, treating infections, healing wounds, balancing hormones, reducing fever, easing pain, detoxifying the body, aiding fertility. These weren't passed down by word of mouth. They were written down, structured, illustrated, with clear methods of use. This wasn't folklore, it was a science. One of the most famous surviving texts is the Codex Badianus, written in 1552. It's considered the first medical book of Latin America. It describes detailed remedies using local herbs, with an almost modern understanding of anatomy and the effects of plants on the human body. But even that book was only preserved because it was copied under the supervision of Spanish priests. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of original manuscripts were burned the moment the Aztec Empire fell. The official reason? Pagan heresy. The real reason? The knowledge was too effective to be allowed. Imagine the moment. Invaders arrive in a so-called New World, armed with guns, disease, and doctrine. But they don't find savages, they find communities with hospitals, steam houses to Mazkal, surgical stitching techniques, and malaria treatments. If that knowledge was accepted, who would still believe in the civilizing mission? Who would still buy into the idea that Europe came to save? Who would still justify colonial rule, knowing people could once heal themselves, care for their own, and protect their bodies? That's why the colonizers didn't start by studying these systems. They started by burning the books, tearing up healing gardens, and banning indigenous people from practicing their medicine. Indigenous medicine was called witchcraft. Indigenous healers were called sorcerers. Indigenous herbs were labeled dangerous poisons. And just like that, knowledge became a sin. Today, many ingredients in modern pharmaceuticals, anti-inflammatories, painkillers, digestive meds, come directly from the same plants the Aztecs once used. But no one mentions that. No one credits Nahua manuscripts. No one acknowledges that someone already knew. An entire medical tradition was wiped from collective memory, not because it failed, but because it didn't fit into the new power structure. When those pages burned, it wasn't just herbs that disappeared. It was an entire relationship with the body that was erased. The Aztecs didn't see healing as just fixing function. They saw it as restoring balance between soul, body, and nature. They didn't separate humans from the earth. They didn't blame illness on individual sin. They didn't hand over all control to someone in a white coat. They saw people as part of a bigger rhythm, where plants, skies, emotions, and landscapes all played a role in well-being. And in a world built on control, that kind of worldview could never be allowed to survive. There's one memory that shows up in almost every ancient civilization, not just in scripture, not just in folklore, but in carefully recorded texts that survived for thousands of years. A memory of a flood, not just a heavy rain or a rising river, but a reset of the entire world. We're used to thinking of this story in biblical terms. Noah, the ark, the animals 2 by 2. But the deeper you dig into ancient sources, the more old inscriptions you read, the harder it becomes to deny. The Great Flood wasn't just a religious tale, it was a global memory, broken into pieces, then claimed by separate belief systems. And maybe, somewhere in that process, the truth got buried. The idea of a world-ending flood with a few chosen survivors didn't start in the Bible. The oldest written version we have comes from Sumerian clay tablets, more than 2,000 years before the Old Testament was compiled. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, a man named Utnapishtim, granted immortality, tells how the gods grew angry with humanity and sent a flood to wipe everything out. But one merciful god warned him, told him to build a massive boat and save his family and all living creatures. Sound familiar? It's nearly identical to the Noah story, but from a different land, a different time, a different set of gods, and it wasn't just the Sumerians. In India, the Matsya Purana tells of the god Vishnu transforming into a giant fish to warn King Manu about a coming flood. Manu builds a boat, gathers sages and animals, and survives the waters of chaos. In China, the tale of Yu the Great describes a flood that lasted generations, and a man chosen by heaven not to fight the flood, but to redirect it, to work with nature, not against it. Still, it's a story of the world reshaped by water. The Maya in the Popol Vuh tell of earlier versions of humanity destroyed by the gods, some by fire, others by water. These weren't divine punishments, but cosmic rebalances triggered when humans lost harmony with nature. In Norse mythology, the gods speak of Ragnarok, the end times, where Loki breaks his bonds, floods pour in, and the old world is swept away in water and fire. From Polynesia to West Africa, from the Hopi in North America to the Batak in Indonesia, Everyone remembers the flood, so if it's just a coincidence, why do they all share the same core elements? A total wipeout. One person, or a small group, chosen to survive. A journey through water, and a world reborn. And if it's not a coincidence, why does mainstream history only validate one version, Noah's? The answer might have less to do with faith and more to do with control. In the ancient religious political world, whoever controlled the story of our origin controlled the definition of what it meant to be human. And if you could define humanity, you could control belief. You could decide who was chosen, who was saved, who spoke for God. The flood story, whether symbolic or literal, isn't just about survival. It's the foundational myth that entire belief systems use to explain sin, punishment, salvation, and obedience. But if we admit that multiple versions exist, then we have to admit something else too, that no one has a monopoly on truth, that there is no single chosen people, that no one divine figure holds all judgment. And maybe that's exactly why most of the flood stories outside the Bible have been forgotten, not because they're weak, but because they don't serve a single narrative. They were labeled myth, while the biblical version got called history. But if you read carefully, you'll hear the same voice in all of them. Not fear the Almighty, but live in balance, or nature will restore it for you. That's not a threat. It's encoded memory from a humanity that once saw the waters rise, and maybe, just maybe, is warning us again. Not all languages are written with letters. Some of the world's oldest knowledge wasn't carved into stone or copied onto parchment. It was passed down through something else, something invisible, but deeper than ink, sound, in an age when the soul wasn't just a concept, but a living, moving force. Music wasn't entertainment. It was a key, a tool, a sacred ritual, a way to open doors the eyes could never see. And in the ancient world, few traditions held on to that belief as clearly as the Orphic hymns, a collection of mystical songs believed to have been left behind by the legendary poet and musician Orpheus. This was a foundational moment for Western spirituality, and yet today almost no one remembers it. In Greek mythology, Orpheus had a voice that could move gods and men. He wasn't a warrior. He didn't conquer with swords. He descended into the underworld to reclaim the soul of his beloved, not with weapons, but with music. That myth wasn't just a tragic love story. It was the seed of an entire mystical philosophy. Orphism, a hidden spiritual tradition that once thrived alongside official Greek religion. Orphics believed the soul is eternal, but trapped in the cycle of reincarnation due to a primordial fault. Life's purpose wasn't to appease distant gods, it was to purify the soul through discipline, knowledge, meditation, and music. And in that system, the Orphic hymns weren't just songs, they were sacred technology. Over 80 hymns, each dedicated to a specific divine force, not to beg, but to commune. Music, through rhythm, frequency, and tone, was believed to synchronize the soul's vibration with the cosmic order. In other words, music wasn't for listening, it was for unlocking. Today we talk about healing music in yoga or meditation, but more than 2,000 years ago, the Orphics knew sound could alter consciousness, and they designed entire rituals around that. They used instruments like the lyre, flute, and soft drums to create harmonic resonance. They chanted the hymns in tune with the lunar cycle, each hymn aligned with a specific mental or spiritual state. They believed sound at the right frequency could remind the soul of its original essence before it was confined by the body. And that is exactly why Orphism became a threat to power. As organized religions rose, from the worship of Zeus to Christianity, from the Byzantine Empire to the Roman Church, Anything that allowed direct access to the soul without priestly control was labeled heresy. The Orphic hymns, once sung in secret rituals at Eleusis, Delphi and Thrace, were branded as fringe, pagan, or worse, and slowly erased from memory. Not because they were wrong, but because they gave spiritual power to individuals. Instead of praying through clergy, Orphics sang to awaken themselves. Instead of fearing judgment, they purified the soul through inner discipline and vibration. And in a world built on centralized control, that was dangerous. Today, the Orphic hymns still survive, but only in dusty translations. They're read like dry poetry, stripped of rhythm, stripped of melody, stripped of vibration, stripped of soul. And maybe the real threat wasn't the words themselves, but what happened when they were sung. One voice, one sound, one soul opening, no church, no titles, no stamp of approval, just listening. And that, both then and now, is exactly what makes the system nervous. A burned book doesn't mark the death of knowledge. Sometimes the very act of destruction is the loudest signal that within those pages lay something more powerful than any weapon: truth. We've traveled through forgotten manuscripts, erased texts, pages labeled heretical, pagan, or superstitious. And yet the one thing they all have in common is this: they never truly disappeared. They were just misplaced, mislabeled, or read through eyes that no longer knew how to see clearly. From the Book of Enoch to the Popol Vuh, from Shanhai Jing to the Orphic hymns, we've seen that the knowledge once forbidden wasn't cast aside because it was nonsense, but because it gave power to the individual, not the institution. And that, across all ages, has always been the hardest thing to forgive. The world isn't lacking in truth. The world is only lacking permission to listen again to what we once already knew. You might not remember every book, every detail, but if there's one thing to carry with you as we close this journey, well, let it be a question. Who has the right to tell you what you're not allowed to read, what you're not allowed to believe, what you're not allowed to remember? And if you don't protect that right, then chances are someone else has been holding it for you for a very long time. Thank you for walking this path to the very end. If what we've uncovered together feels worth sharing, leave a comment, even just a period, a single word, a passing thought, because that's how burned books come back to life, through retelling, through remembrance, through people like you. And if you'd like to join us on more journeys through forgotten history, where truth always runs deeper than it seems, make sure to subscribe. We still have so much more to uncover together.